Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the heavy wooden doors of the closed-door meeting deep inside the Capitol. The midday sun hit her determined face, casting sharp light on a moment that had already started to shake Washington. Just minutes earlier, behind those tightly sealed doors, no cameras, no press, a heated exchange had erupted. Words that were meant to stay buried within the walls of power had somehow made their way into the public. And now, all of America was listening. A calm but unmistakable voice echoed in the leaked recording. It was Hakeem Jeffries, the House Minority Leader, long hailed as the cautious heir to Democratic leadership. On the tape, he warned that if voices like Crockett's continued to gain traction, major donors would start pulling out. He claimed that fundamentally transformative policies were driving away centrist voters. And he said it all with startling calm, like trading away ideals for funding was just part of doing politics. But to Jasmine Crockett, those words weren't just a personal slight. They were a rejection of the very ideals she and millions of voters had stood for. As a former civil rights attorney and a daughter of Texas's black working class, she hadn't come to Congress to stay quiet in the face of power. And today, she had no intention of staying silent. She now stood before the press, dozens of cameras locked onto her, and millions watching the live stream across the country. No prepared remarks, no talking points from consultants. Just the truth and a phone filled with data, emails, and internal documents no one expected her to reveal. A political storm was brewing, and at the center of it stood a showdown you're about to witness. Stay with us until the very last moment, because this isn't just another political debate. This is the moment truth demands to be heard. Outside the Capitol, the scene was turning chaotic. Text messages, video clips, and a leaked audio recording were spreading like wildfire across social media. Washington felt as if it had been shaken awake by a political explosion no one saw coming. But at the eye of the storm, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't hide behind aides. She didn't look away from the cameras. She stood tall eyes forward and started to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. So clear, it cut through the noise of dozens of microphones and reporters shouting for answers. She didn't open with a polished speech, no poetic language, just this. I heard what was said behind those closed doors. I know what was recorded. And if anyone's wondering whether I regret standing for what I believe in, the answer is no. Not now. Not ever. Reporters stirred. One raised his hand and asked, "Is it true party leadership called progressive policies a threat to campaign funding?" Jasmine nodded. Then, without theatrics, she took out her phone. No emotion-driven monologue. No plea for sympathy. She opened an internal email leaked just days earlier, in which a senior advisor to Hakeem Jeffries explicitly said that calls for a higher minimum wage, universal health care, and real climate reform should be delayed out of concern over how donors might react. She looked into the cameras. This isn't speculation. This is real. And if anyone thinks I'm going to stay silent while people in my district are working 3 jobs and still can't afford rent, then they picked the wrong person to come after. The atmosphere thickened. Every word she spoke landed like a hammer blow against the crumbling facade of old power. Another reporter asked, "But aren't you worried that this kind of public conflict might hurt the party in the next election?" Jasmine gave a small, bitter smile. "Not the smug kind, but the kind that says, 'You still don't get it,'" she replied. "What weakens us isn't disagreement. What weakens us is pretending unity on the outside while falling apart on the inside. People aren't walking away from us because we argue. They're walking away because they don't see honesty. They see broken promises. They see deals being cut behind doors they're never allowed to open." By now, it wasn't just journalists watching. A group of students from Howard University had gathered nearby. A few union workers just off their shifts. A young mother holding her child. They didn't come for a viral clip. They came because they heard something different. Not slogans, not spin, but the voice of someone who was actually fighting for them. Jasmine kept going. She spoke of children breathing in toxic air because the same company's funding campaigns were operating factories right next to public schools. She said people don't need more promises. They need action. And if her honesty made some in her own party uncomfortable, then maybe that discomfort was long overdue. She didn't have a war chest. She didn't have a team of strategists. But she had one thing the old system feared most: the truth. And she knew how to use it like a blade cutting clean through pretense. This story isn't over. It's only just beginning. And what you're about to witness will force you to ask the very question America can no longer avoid. Who really represents the people who's speaking for you? Inside the main studio headquarters of MSNBC, the air in the control room was stretched tight like a wire about to snap. Producers rushed back and forth with headsets and clipboards in hand. The live broadcast was just minutes away. Hakeem Jeffries had arrived early, seated in the VIP green room. His tie was perfectly straight, the lighting carefully arranged to highlight the polished confidence on his face. But this time, there was a tension in the air that even the crew could feel. Because sitting across from him in the studio wasn't a tame journalist or a friendly centrist. It was Jasmine Crockett. And she didn't come empty-handed. As the intro music played and the live feed began, the screen split in two. On one side, Jeffries, the man long touted as the bridge between old-school Democratic leadership and the new generation. On the other, Crockett, the woman who didn't follow scripts and wasn't afraid to name the things the system desperately tried to hide. The host opened with what sounded like a simple question. We're seeing a rare public disagreement within the Democratic Party. Can the two of you explain where the core difference in your approaches lies? Jeffries went first as usual, with a carefully crafted answer. He spoke of the need for unity, the importance of a moderate strategy to win elections. He cautioned against internal conflicts that might damage broader goals. Jasmine listened calmly, silently. She didn't interrupt, but when it was her turn, she didn't echo old talking points. She didn't soften her stance. She looked straight into the camera and said, "There's a fundamental difference here. One side believes change is a risk. The other believes not changing is the real danger. When people stop believing in promises, when they see leaders say one thing and do another, that's when we lose the only thing keeping our democracy alive, trust." Jeffries furrowed his brow slightly. He tried to pivot. He said, "We're working with partners to deliver practical reforms, but extreme demands can alienate voters." Jasmine raised her chin. What's extreme is when 3 companies control the pharmaceutical market and hike insulin prices to 10 times the cost of production. What's extreme is a child being denied treatment because their family doesn't have insurance. And what's most extreme is party leadership elected by the people meeting behind closed doors with big donors to decide which policies are allowed to survive. The studio fell quiet. The host glanced at the clock, ready to move the conversation forward, but Jasmine wasn't done. She picked up her tablet and held up a chart. This is DNC data, not mine. According to internal surveys, over 70% of Democratic voters support Medicare for all. And yet just 3 months ago, we were told by leadership to shelve that proposal for the sake of donor stability. Stability for who? Jeffries tried to respond. He said political decisions are complicated. You can't boil them down to numbers. But Jasmine didn't back off. She turned to him and said, "Complicated doesn't mean irresponsible. No one forced us to run for office. But once we do, our first job is to represent voters, not corporations." That moment sent a wave of silence through the studio, not out of shock, but recognition. People felt it. Something real had just been said. A truth that millions had thought about, but no one inside the room had dared to say aloud. The program continued, but the balance of power had shifted. It was no longer tilted toward the person with the higher title or longer resume. It tilted toward the one with more courage. And the viewers tuning in weren't just political junkies. They were people searching for something honest in a world drowning in spin and compromise. Less than an hour after the live MSNBC broadcast ended, social media was on fire. From Twitter to TikTok, from political forums to Facebook groups of teachers, nurses, and warehouse workers, everyone was talking about the unprecedented showdown between Jasmine Crockett and Hakeem Jeffries. Within 30 minutes, millions had already rewatched the moment Jasmine cited internal DNC data, spoke about children denied medical care, and stared down one of the most powerful figures in her own party without blinking. The hashtag Jasmine got receipts shot to the top of the trending charts. A short clip of her saying complicated doesn't mean irresponsible was shared at lightning speed. Even those who had doubted her, who once saw her as just another loud voice in the progressive wing, now had to admit she had just set a new standard for how party leadership should be challenged. Not with vague outrage, but with data, with preparation, with a cold, unshakable integrity. Meanwhile, Hakeem Jeffries' office was in full-blown crisis mode. Senior staff held emergency meetings. Communications advisors scrambled to rewrite the press statement. A spokesperson quickly released a short message stating that Mr. Jeffries supported robust internal debate, but rejected what he called misrepresentations and selective framing of his views. Notably, the statement did not dispute a single data point Jasmine had presented. That same day, major media outlets began publishing analyses. One political strategist wrote in the Washington Post that Jasmine Crockett had just redefined what confrontation inside a political party could look like. She didn't yell, she didn't attack personalities, she let the facts speak, and by doing so, she forced the old system to listen. That evening, several progressive members of Congress received thousands of emails from constituents, not just applauding Jasmine, but urging others to step up and speak out. One anonymous member told reporters that a private strategy call was immediately organized among progressives. The central question had shifted. No longer should we confront leadership, now it was, what do we do next? Within 24 hours, grassroots groups across the country began holding town halls to discuss how to organize around the policies Jasmine had highlighted. From Milwaukee to Philadelphia, Oakland, to Miami, citizens printed out the charts she'd shown on air. They shared clips. They hung posters that read, "People fear the truth because truth doesn't negotiate." A high school teacher in Pennsylvania tweeted today, "For the first time in years, I feel like someone in Congress actually represents me. Not just saying what I want to hear, but saying it even when it makes others uncomfortable." Conservative media didn't miss the moment either. Fox News ran with the headline, "Democrats in Civil War." But even some of their commentators had to concede, though they disagreed with Jasmine's policies, they couldn't deny she had won the confrontation. And she didn't do it with theatrics. She did it with precision. And as night fell across the country, a question began to ripple across talk shows, dinner tables, and living rooms alike. If this is the future of the Democratic Party, are we witnessing the rise of a new generation of leadership, one that is honest, principled, and unafraid to do what's right, even when it comes at a cost? 3 days after that historic confrontation, Hakeem Jeffries' office sent a formal invitation to members of the Progressive Caucus, including Jasmine Crockett, requesting a closed-door meeting aimed at rebuilding trust and reinforcing the party's unified message. On the surface, it looked like a gesture of reconciliation. But to seasoned political observers, it was clear the system only agrees to talk when it feels cornered. And this time, it was Jasmine Crockett who had pushed it all the way to the edge. The meeting took place in a private conference room on the top floor of the Capitol. No press, no cameras, just elected officials who for too long had stayed silent under the weight of party loyalty, now forced to face one another without the luxury of pretending everything was fine. Jeffries arrived first, maintaining his usual composed demeanor. Jasmine entered later, carrying a thick folder, not to perform for the public, but to speak directly, face to face. The atmosphere was tense from the start. A few moderate members suggested that everyone keep the tone down and remember we're on the same team. But Jasmine quickly steered the room back to the heart of the matter. She said she didn't come to apologize for telling the truth, and she wasn't there to be pacified by vague reassurances. She said, "If we keep prioritizing comfort over honesty, we'll lose the very people who put us in these seats." A younger lawmaker who had previously kept his distance from the progressive wing spoke up. He said constituents in his district had already started emailing, asking about the data Jasmine presented. They didn't want spin. They wanted answers. What followed wasn't a shouting match, it was a long overdue release of truth. A veteran black congressman admitted he'd seen humanitarian provisions quietly removed from bills after a single phone call from lobbyists. A first-term Asian American representative shared how she was pressured not to speak up about drug prices during her tight race in a swing state. The room for a moment felt stripped bare. The layers of political performance peeled back. And in that space, the labels of progressive and moderate faded. What remained were people forced to confront a shared truth that their party had grown too comfortable prioritizing strategy over responsibility. And the truth finally was refusing to stay quiet. Jasmine didn't claim victory. She didn't have to. Because what mattered wasn't who won the debate, it was what came next. And in that moment, a new proposal began to take shape. It called for the creation of an internal oversight committee tasked with publicly tracking large political donations and their influence on the legislative process. This wasn't just symbolic. It was a signal the way things had been couldn't continue. Outside the Capitol, no one knew exactly what was said in that meeting, but the country could feel the ground shifting. Disillusioned voters started sending thank you emails. Grassroots organizations began strategizing to support candidates who actually reflected their values. And in some civics, classrooms across America, students started asking new questions: who truly represents us? And how can we tell the difference between someone speaking truth and someone just playing the part? Because from the moment Jasmine stepped into the light, the inner workings of power in the Democratic Party had to face a new reality. The truth once spoken doesn't go back into hiding. And when someone walks into the halls of power carrying proof, they don't just challenge the narrative, they change the rules of the game. In the week following the closed-door meeting at the Capitol, the ripple effects of Jasmine Crockett's showdown with Hakeem Jeffries were still unfolding. But what was happening now didn't look like a fleeting controversy. It felt more like a quiet but powerful shift, spreading from the corridors of Washington out to neighborhoods, classrooms, and union halls across America. This was no longer just a story about a young congresswoman challenging the party's top leader. What was resonating now was the collective sense that finally someone had said out loud what so many had kept buried. On the airwaves, political talk shows began changing the tone of their questions. It wasn't about who won or lost anymore. It was, is the Democratic Party ready to enter an era of real transparency? And can voices like Jasmine survive the wave of pressure to compromise? Jasmine, for her part, kept going about her work. But now every move she made was being watched. Every speech she gave on the House floor was clipped and shared millions of times. Every chart or financial figure she posted on social media was downloaded, annotated, and circulated. People weren't just listening to her for inspiration anymore. They were learning from her, preparing themselves. Inside the party, new alliances were forming, not along ideological lines of progressive versus moderate, but around a new standard, who's willing to disclose their donors, who's willing to stand with voters, not sidestep hard questions. Some long-established politicians, once shielded by deep connections and political finesse, now found themselves under pressure. Constituents were writing in asking about old votes, about corporate contributions, about why their reps wouldn't take a clear stand on basic issues like a living wage or universal health care. In an exclusive interview with The Atlantic, Jasmine said she never intended to trigger a political earthquake. She was simply tired of sitting in rooms where people said one thing and did another. She said, if telling the truth comes with a cost, I'm willing to pay it. But if we keep living in fear of losing funding, we'll eventually lose the people's trust. And when that happens, no seat in Congress is safe. In universities across the country, political science professors started using the Crockett-Jeffries exchange as a case study, not because it was combative, but because of how Jasmine used evidence. How she controlled the tempo, how she asked questions that exposed contradictions her opponent couldn't explain away. A professor at Georgetown University put it this way: Jasmine doesn't argue to win. She argues to reveal what others are trying to hide. And that makes her the most dangerous kind of person in a system built on silence and agreement. The atmosphere outside Congress had shifted too. Small protests were evolving into public forums. People came not just with signs, but with spreadsheets, public records, donation logs. They weren't just angry, they were organized. And many of them said it was that moment when Jasmine calmly held up her tablet on live television, nodded and said, "Complicated doesn't mean irresponsible." That convinced them they had the right to demand more. Real change always starts the same way. One person, one sentence, one small act that hits a nerve buried too long. When that happens, it doesn't just begin a story, it sparks a fire. And Jasmine didn't just spark one. She lit something no apology or press release can extinguish. This isn't a debate anymore, this is a movement. And it's growing by the day. 1 week later, at a town hall in Dallas, Texas, Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage. No script, no staging, and no protective barrier of polished political language. The venue was modest, just a community center where working-class folks, teachers, college students, and retirees had gathered to listen, ask questions, and hope that someone on that stage might actually understand their lives. She began with something rare in politics. She admitted she gets tired of always having to prove that truth still deserves respect. Tired of receiving private messages from colleagues asking why she can't just keep the peace every time she speaks plainly. But she said it's the emails, the DMs, the quick conversations with strangers on the street, that's what keeps her going. Because she knows there are millions of people out there waiting for someone who refuses to bow their head. The room fell silent as she told the story of single mothers who called her office not to ask for help but just to cry. They cried because someone had finally said out loud what they thought no one in Congress even saw. One woman told her that just hearing someone admit drug prices were outrageous made her feel visible. Jasmine paused, scanning the room as if trying to memorize every face. Then she continued, "We don't need great leaders. We need leaders who know how to listen." A freshman sociology student stood and asked, "How can an ordinary person really make an impact?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. She said, "Start by asking questions. Stop accepting vague answers. Stop treating politics like it's something distant. Because if you're not the one asking, someone else is, and the answers won't be meant for you. She talked about her first time walking into the Capitol, not feeling small but angry. Angry because inside those marble halls, too many people talked about the people without ever having lived like them. They didn't know what it felt like to be denied insurance, to choose between medicine and groceries. But I do, Jasmine said, because I've lived in that world, and I carry it with me into every decision I make. The event lasted longer than expected. No one left early. Some stood along the walls, phones raised, recording every word as if witnessing something far greater than a campaign event. Others took notes not because they were reporters, but because they wanted to take her words home and repeat them to their families. When it ended, Jasmine didn't rush to her car. She stayed. She talked to every person who came up. She listened to stories you don't find in policy reports. An elderly woman handed her a handwritten card. Inside it read, "You made me believe politics isn't completely dead." That night on her flight back to Washington, Jasmine didn't sleep. What filled her wasn't pride. It was responsibility. Because she understood that when people start to believe, betrayal becomes that much more painful. And she made herself a promise not to betray that belief. Not for pressure, not for opportunity, not for the easier path. She opened her phone and went back to reviewing documents for an upcoming hearing. A new bill was about to be introduced, one demanding transparency in political donations. And Jasmine Crockett, once a first-term congresswoman from Texas, was quickly becoming a symbol of a new generation of voters, a generation that doesn't settle for less than the truth. That won't accept promises without action, that refuses to be represented by people who no longer understand the pain of ordinary lives. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. Just a few days after the town hall in Dallas, word began to spread about a new internal hearing called by the House Ethics Committee. For the first time in years, the spotlight wasn't on misconduct from the opposing party. It was turned inward on the Democratic Party itself. The issue: potential conflicts of interest between political donations and legislative decisions made by those in power, and the person who initiated the call for public testimony, none other than Jasmine Crockett. Many had doubted her. They assumed that after going toe-to-toe with Hakeem Jeffries, Jasmine would be smoothed over, absorbed into the machinery of compromise, slowly neutralized by the system. They were wrong. Not only did she keep pushing, she pushed further. She came forward with concrete proposals to rein in the influence of money in Congress. And this time she wasn't armed only with bold statements. She brought meticulously drafted bills, clearly worded provisions, and an oversight framework built for transparency and accountability. The hearing wasn't televised, but according to one anonymous Capitol staffer, the room nearly erupted the moment Jasmine began. She didn't launch personal attacks. She asked questions, many of them. Why are bills to regulate drug prices constantly delayed at the last minute? Why are worker protections stripped from legislation without public debate? And why are large political contributions never required to be disclosed in real time? No one in the room offered a direct response, but the silence that followed was louder than any rebuttal. It was the kind of silence that confirms what everyone already knows, but no one wants to admit the system has long thrived in darkness. Outside that hearing room, the ripple effects spread fast. Civic organizations, watchdog groups, even student councils across major universities rallied together demanding that Congress pass what they were now calling the Crockett Rules, a new standard for financial transparency in political decision-making. Several younger lawmakers, once silent in closed-door meetings, began to speak up publicly. One admitted that Jasmine gave them the cover they needed to finally speak the truth without being labeled a radical. Another confessed they once thought she was too dangerous, but now they saw she was exactly what the system needed. The media started asking a bigger question. If Jasmine represents a new force in American politics, who will follow her lead? Is this the beginning of a broader realignment? One where voices once pushed to the margins begin rewriting the rules of power? Outside the hearing room during a brief press gaggle, Jasmine offered only one sentence, quiet but resounding. We cannot keep living in a democracy where those elected by the people serve the loudest wallet instead of the most vulnerable voice. It landed not as a soundbite, but as a warning. A message not just to lawmakers in Washington, but to millions watching from afar. That if we don't start asking questions, if we don't begin demanding truth, the system will keep doing what it was built to do, protect the powerful and pretend the rest of us aren't watching. The hearing ended without a clear resolution, but everyone in the room knew something had shifted. And that shift didn't come from a resolution or a committee vote. It came from one person willing to stand up, carry the truth, ask the uncomfortable questions, and most importantly, refuse to back down. 1 month after that explosive hearing, the wave Jasmine Crockett had unleashed was no longer a passing moment. It had started to take shape, a real structured movement with tangible reach. Across the country, citizens began organizing community meetings to discuss political transparency and campaign finance reform. They weren't waiting for Congress to act. They were acting themselves. They were teaching each other how to read financial disclosures. They were demanding clear answers from their local representatives. No more ambiguity, no more vague talking points. Inside Congress, the silence began to crack. Under mounting pressure from public opinion and the press, a few long-serving members started to express cautious support for Jasmine's proposals, even those who had previously kept their distance. A handful of lawmakers from swing districts, typically the most careful and risk-averse, publicly backed specific portions of the Crockett rules, especially those requiring detailed disclosures of corporate donations to legislative comités. Jasmine didn't act like she'd won anything. She knew the system doesn't collapse from one speech or one hearing. It changes only when the truth is spoken again and again relentlessly, and when those words are backed by real action. She spent most of her time back on the road, not just in Texas, but in Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, places where people had long felt forgotten by the political machine. In every stop, she didn't give speeches. She asked questions. She listened. She took notes. And most importantly, she brought those stories back to Congress, turning them into talking points, into numbers, into legislative clauses. One Friday afternoon in a small meeting room at a community college in Flint, Michigan, Jasmine sat face-to-face with about 30 residents, mostly parents, factory workers, and students. A middle-aged white man in a technician's uniform raised his hand and said, "I don't agree with all your views, but I believe you, because you don't dodge, and just that makes you different." Jasmine smiled and replied, "You don't have to agree with everything. I just want you to have the full truth so you can decide for yourself." That's what sets her apart. While many politicians carefully craft their image, curate their language, and filter their information, like a branding campaign, Jasmine embraces the risk of transparency. She's not trying to please everyone, but she always shows up with enough facts, enough clarity, and enough respect to speak plainly. In the policy discussions that followed, Jasmine's name came up more and more, not as an outsider, but as a central figure. The financial committees could no longer ignore the proposals they once shelved. A bill requiring real-time disclosure of large political contributions, once stalled indefinitely, was suddenly back on the agenda. Not because the system wanted to change, but because Jasmine and the movement behind her had made ignoring it impossible. A veteran columnist at Politico put it this way: Jasmine isn't tearing down the system. She's doing something far more terrifying. She's holding up a mirror. And once that mirror is up, no one can pretend they don't see what's been happening behind the scenes. Big change in politics rarely comes from scandals or headlines. It comes from steady footsteps, relentless voices, and people who refuse to treat silence as strategy. Jasmine doesn't chant slogans. She builds momentum. And that momentum is spreading to every street corner, every ballot box, every hard question. Voters are finally asking with one clear message: if you represent us, then you answer to us. Not every 4 years, every single day. One quiet weekend afternoon in a small stadium on the south side of Houston, Jasmine Crockett stepped onto a makeshift wooden platform. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic background music, no polished campaign stage, just her, a handheld mic, and more than 1,000 people who had shown up on their own. Some had been sitting in the sun for hours. Some brought their kids. Some still wore their work uniforms, hands stained with grease. They had come for one simple reason: they wanted to hear the truth from someone brave enough to speak it. Jasmine didn't start with big declarations. She told the story of a white man from rural Kentucky who had written her a letter by hand. In it, he said he had never voted for a Democrat. But after watching her confrontation on MSNBC, he felt maybe for the first time that someone in Congress actually understood what it meant to live like him. Poor, uninsured, politically invisible. Jasmine read a line from his letter aloud. "I don't agree with all your policies, but for the first time, I believe someone in government doesn't see me as just another statistic." She paused, looked out at the crowd, and said slowly, "This isn't about party. It's about people, about those being left behind, about how the political system keeps breaking promises every 4 years." and about choice. The choice between accepting that or taking our voices back. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was real. Some didn't clap at all. They nodded quietly, solemnly, because they knew what she was saying wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to remind. A man near the front leaned over and whispered to his friend, "This doesn't feel like a campaign rally. It feels like healing." Jasmine kept going. She said every person in that stadium held a weapon stronger than any media strategy memory. Memory of being denied help, of unpayable medical bills, of promises made and never kept. And if we keep those memories alive, if we turn them into action, then every seat of power will have to listen. She didn't ask them to vote for her. She asked them not to back down, not to stop asking questions, not to let anyone, regardless of party, mistake their silence for consent. Because if there's one thing she's learned in Congress, it's this. The system doesn't change because it wants to. It changes when someone forces it to. When her speech ended, Jasmine didn't leave the stage. She stepped down into the crowd. She shook every hand. She sat and talked with an elderly Vietnamese woman. She hugged a baby whose parents had named him Justice. She didn't promise it would be easy, but she left them with one message, a message that would soon spread across social media. She said politics isn't a stage, it's a mirror. And if we don't look into it every day, someone else will step up and pretend to represent us, but they'll only reflect their own interests. That night, one image went viral across platforms. It was Jasmine kneeling to meet the eyes of an 8-year-old boy, listening intently as he shared his dream of becoming a lawyer. The photo was captioned, "Sometimes change doesn't begin with a ballot. It starts with a conversation, a look. Someone daring to believe that truth still has a place in this world." And that is what Jasmine Crockett has done. She didn't just bring the truth into the light. She made people believe in it again. If you believe the truth deserves to be heard, if you believe politics should serve people, not power, then don't forget to hit that follow button so you never miss a story that challenges the system and changes the game. Share this video if you know someone who needs a reminder. Transparency still matters, and in the end, it still has power. And in the comments, tell us what makes you believe. Is it a promise, an action, or someone brave enough to speak up, even when they know it comes at a cost? We'll see you in the next video, where truth is always the starting point.